Hello, everyone. My name is Charlotte, and I am the president of the New York City Museum Educators Roundtable, and I am really thrilled to welcome you all to this program today about unionization and employee protections in museums, a topic that is more important than ever, but that really is something that has been on our mind for a long time. As some of you may know, this is a program that we had originally planned to hold in March in person at NYU, and they were lovely hosts. But of course, just as so many other plans were affected, our plans had to change very quickly as we realized the scale and the scope of the novel coronavirus and its impacts on our city, the country, and the nation. We had to cancel that program in the moment, but it was something that we really wanted to be able to hold in the future, because this is a topic that we've been wanting to bring to our members, bring resources to our members, bring conversation to our members and other museum educators and others working with museum educators at all levels. And so our amazing all-volunteer board of trustees of NYCMER really pulled it together through all this to make sure that we could continue to have this program in a virtual format. So really feel very fortunate to work with such amazing people on the board who really felt that this was so important and pulled it together with our amazing panelists and moderator to make this happen. I do want to point out that we do have captioning available for this program. If you click on the bottom of your screen, you should see that as an option. And so we're really appreciative of Total Captioning Total Caption for providing that today. So please do click on that if you would like to use that. So as I mentioned, this program is a long time coming. This is something that we discussed that came up as well during our annual conference in May, which many of you may have participated in. That was something where our volunteer conference committee and our vice president really quickly pivoted to turn into a virtual format. And we're so appreciative of our conference committee members, board members, and all of the presenters who did that. And during that, there were a number of times that it came up, this idea of what do we do about the large scale layoffs, job cuts, hours cuts, furloughing happening in our field during this time. And there were a number of ideas that came up during that time, both about unionization, but also other forms of organizing. And so we're excited to really build off of a lot of those conversations that came up during that time with this program. So in just a moment, I'll be introducing our moderator, Rachel Bernstein, the Director of Labor Arts, to introduce them, the rest of our panelists. But I just want to say just a few words about NYCMER, since I know many of you are familiar, but for others, this might be your first NYCMER program. NYCMER, the New York City Museum Educators Roundtable, has been around since 1979. It was founded by about 6 museum educators in New York City. And since then, it's grown to an organization with approximately 700 members from across New York City and the surrounding area, and potentially growing even more as we've had to focus more on virtual programming. We are a professional development organization. We provide free monthly programs for our members, knowing that not everyone has the same access to that. We also have a job board where we require salaries and wages as part of our effort for salary transparency as a form of equity. We also have amazing peer groups, which are informal, well, they're coming increasingly formal, but gatherings of people by identity, by professional interest, by career level that come together to share resources, go to trainings with each other, do site visits, whether in person or virtual, and they are a really wonderful resource for our members. We also have resources on our website, and I'll just note that after this program, we will compile resources from the panelists as well as others that we found, which we'll be posting on our website, on the resources section of our website, available to all members. And we'll also be sending it out to all attendees along with a survey about the program. I do hope if you aren't already a member that you do consider becoming a member. We keep our prices for membership very low in order for the most people possible to be able to take advantage of that. And if you have any concerns, you can always reach out to us. I do want to say this is my last program as president of NYCMER. I've been president for the past 2 years, and it's really been a wonderful opportunity to serve the amazing community of museum educators and professionals and students across this city to advocate for our audiences and try to move this field forward for the better. And so I'm really going to miss that. I'll be on next year in an advisory capacity, but I know that some amazing board members are taking over and will be continuing these conversations and doing amazing work next year. So I'm really excited about that and to continue to support their efforts as they go forward. And I'm also really excited to be finishing on this program, which, like I said, is something we've had in our mind for a long time and has only increased in urgency as we've seen a tremendous number of job cuts and furloughs and lost hours over the past several months through this crisis, as well as the very real impact on people through loss of family members and other things as well. And so I want to be very mindful of that as well. And also keep in mind that, of course, these impacts are not distributed equally across our society and across our field as a reflection of that. And knowing very much that those who are most impacted both by the coronavirus and by these job losses are those who have the fewest protections and are most susceptible to kind of the ills of society. And so I do want to reflect on that as well, and just acknowledge that this has significantly impacted people of color, including notably Black members of our field, as well as other people of color and people with disabilities and everything. And so I just want to acknowledge that as we go forward. And so on that note, I am really excited to launch this conversation. And so I'm going to be welcoming onto the screen, taking my space on here, Rachel Bernstein, who's the Director of Labor Arts and will be moderating this conversation. So thank you so much. And I'm handing it over to Rachel. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you, Charlotte. So I'm a public historian. I taught in the NYU graduate program in public history for 25 years. I'm the author of a book called Ordinary People, Extraordinary Lives, A Pictorial History of New York City Workers in the 20th Century, with the late Deborah Bernhardt, whom some of you may know. I direct a project called Labor Arts, which you can find online at laborarts.org. And I've worked as a public historian with a lot of museums over the years, and especially with the Museum of the City of New York and their activism gallery. So I just want to mention that because one of the resources you might consider if you're looking into the history of unionization is a recent exhibit in that gallery called City of Work, City of Struggle. So thank you for helping me, and thank you so much, panel, for being here. And Allison Belvin is our first panelist. She's a labor and employment lawyer. Allison. Hi, Allison.
Everyone, thank you. As Rachel said, my name is Allison Belvin. I am a partner at the Levy-Ratner law firm in New York City. Unions and employees in a wide range of labor and employment matters. I've spent the last 24 plus years, among other things, helping workers form unions and negotiating collective bargaining agreements with employers on behalf of workers. I also work with independent contractors and freelancers in terms of employment matters that they are dealing with outside of the union context. A big issue, I know, for museums and other institutions. And I just want to thank NYCMER for inviting me here today. I'm happy to be here and really looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Allison. Next, we have Natasha Bunton, who is the director of the Cultural Workers Education Center. Welcome, Natasha.
Hi, I am Natasha Bunton, and I am the director of the Culture Workers Education Center. We are a not-for-profit organization that launched in fall of this past year in 2019, which feels about 2 decades ago already. And we are focused on being a platform for workers in the visual arts field. And we call workers very expansive. We're very expansive in terms of definition of workers. So it includes security guards, it includes curators, it includes arts administrators, you name it. Anybody that's working in our industry is more than welcome to be a part of our programs. And we focus on providing resources and materials, particularly educational materials for people in our field around their workplace rights with an eye toward organizing and bringing people together. And for me personally, where I got involved was after a 15-year career working both inside and outside of museums. I think probably most notably recently at the Guggenheim Museum, working on emerging artist acquisitions, and currently part-time with the Bronx Museum. I realized that these organizations, both large and small, really were not kind of meeting the needs of myself and peers in terms of long-term workplace stability, economic and peer-to-peer advancement. And so along with a cohort of equally concerned arts workers, started working on the outline for this organization, and we arrived at it in fall of last year.
Welcome. We're going to turn next to Dan McCabe, who is the council representative in the white collar division of DC 37, the American Federation of County and Municipal Workers.
I'm sorry, I spend a lot of time speaking on behalf of others. I never really say much about me. Am I introducing myself to the gang?
You have 1 minute to tell
Sorry.
us everything about yourself.
Good, there's not much, I'll be brief. So in the late 90s, I became a security guard at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I thought I'd work over the winter while I figured out what I wanted to do. And then over the next 18 years, I became the steward and then a member of the union's e-board and the local president. And then the past several years, I left and worked for the actual parent union as a union rep, where I currently work as with all the cultural institutions that we at DC 37 represent. I particularly work with all the gardens, the New York Public Library, and I'm still the rep at the Met. And I mostly do contract enforcement, but also internal and external organizing, negotiations, labor management meetings. I don't like to call myself a fixer. It has a bad word, but let's say I put out little brush fires throughout the city on behalf of the sisters and brothers who are members of the cultural institution unions.
Terrific. And our fourth panelist is Maida Rosenstein, who is the president of Local 2110. Maida, welcome.
Hi.
Okay.
So should I introduce myself?
Indeed.
Well, very glad to be here and to be part of this panel. My name is Maida Rosenstein. I am the president of Local 2110 of the United Auto Workers Union. We are not auto workers. We are a technical office and professional workers local. We represent many university and workers at cultural institutions, notably the Museum of Modern Art, Brooklyn Academy of Music, Tenement Museum, and a bunch of others. I personally have been in the labor movement for over 30 years. I was an office worker at Columbia University back in the 80s, and we decided to organize a union and took on the university and won and learned how to fight back, and the rest is history. So very glad to be here and excited.
Welcome, everybody. We are very lucky to have all four of you. I want to start us off with a poem. It's not a long one. It's by Ross Gay from 2015. and it's called A Small Needful Fact. A small needful fact is that Eric Gardner worked for some time for the Parks and Rec Horticultural Department, which means perhaps that his very large hands, perhaps in all likelihood, he put gently into the earth some plants, which most likely, some of them, in all likelihood, continue to grow, continue to do what such plants do, like house and feed small necessary creatures, like being pleasant to touch and smell, like converting sunlight into food, like making it easier for us to breathe. We are gathering in a difficult time, and both a global pandemic and an intense national conversation about racial violence have arisen since we started planning this event. So I just want to say the board of NYCMER has done an amazing job imagining the panel in the first place, changing it as we go along, and also they suggested that poem. So thank you for having us. When very well-educated people work at high-status cultural institutions, the mundane questions of wages and working conditions are often hard to address directly. And the reasons are of long-standing, and no doubt everyone in the audience is familiar with them. The notion that the work is a labor of love is shorthand for a lot of these reasons. And one photo, one example, historical example I want to just mention can stand in for many of them. It's a photo from the Ordinary People, Extraordinary Lives book, 1935. It's office workers, maybe some of the precursors to Maida's Union. They're standing on the street in Midtown wearing barrels. They're wearing barrels and nothing else except a collar. The collar is white, and their signs say, "Wake up, your white collar is all you have." And the sign has a drawing of a naked man wearing a white collar. And he's sitting there saying, well, my collar is still white. And this issue of identity and whether or not it's possible to have solidarity in white collar professions is at the heart of the challenges that museum educators are facing. Teachers, office workers, writers, journalists have all had some success winning better conditions by banding together in labor unions. And that effort is part of a larger process, a larger cultural phenomenon called a culture of solidarity, a culture where many people go beyond the American dream of individualism and see hope in working toward the welfare of the many. And it has taken many forms, not all of them unions. It has had a lot of setbacks and divisions, and yet that movement and that culture of solidarity is the reasons we have laws. They're not good enough. We don't always follow them, but it's the reason we have laws that protect our ill and elderly, that help us educate our young, that protect workers, that create democracy in the workplace. And when that culture of solidarity is the strongest is when there turned out to be the most links with cultural workers and artists, links and coalitions. And so what's exciting about tonight is that you all we're here to talk about unionization and a culture of solidarity among museum educators who are, I guess by definition, cultural workers. That's where you work. And our panelists have some very practical things to say, as well as some more philosophical ones. And one other thing, I think it's in times of real hardship that we also find a moment when people are motivated to stand together. And I think the response to this panel tonight, just in terms of people signing up, is an indication that now might be the moment. But so I want to turn first to Allison with one of the many questions that we got during the pre-survey. Who is allowed to be in a union and what kind of challenges do they face? Allison. So you maybe didn't hear the question. Allison.
I didn't. Sorry. I was just brought back in.
Yes, yes. So we're turning first to Allison, who's going to start off by talking a little bit about who is allowed to be in a union. and what kind of challenges they face on a variety of.
Right. So workers' eligibility to join a union and form a union is governed by federal labor law. The statute is called the National Labor Relations Act, and it provides, governs who can join a union. It guarantees workers the right to form a union, the right to engage in activities in support of a union, and once a union is formed, the right to engage in collective bargaining with an employer over terms and conditions of employment, the obvious things like wages and hours and benefits, also some less obvious things, including health and safety or professional development. All of those things that inform who you are as a worker and what your relationship is with your boss can be bargains for. It also protects workers who engage in union activities, form a union, from retaliation for doing those things. All workers can join a union except, and there are some exceptions, basically workers who are supervisors or managers are not able to join a union, and workers who are independent contractors or freelancers are not able to join a union under the National Labor Relations Act. And those things are defined legally. There is, I want to speak specifically on this issue though about independent contractors and freelancers for a moment, because I think that this is an issue in industries all over the place, and we're seeing it crop up in the arts and in museums and cultural institutions particularly. There is rampant misclassification of workers as independent contractors or freelancers with either the intention or even without the effect of denying a lot of workers rights, not only the right to unionize, but other rights as well. And so something we're always on the lookout for is misclassification of workers as independent contractors who really are true, regular, run-of-the-mill employees. And there's lots of legal tests for that, but I think the big foundational thing you want to think about is who has the control over my work? Is it me? Do I get to decide when I work, where I work, how I work? If so, then maybe I am really a freelancer, really an independent contractor. But if it's my boss, my museum, that's deciding when I have to come to work and where I have to go to work and how I do my job, then I'm probably not. And then I probably am really a worker that's entitled to all of the rights of the National Labor Relations Act and other employment statutes that protect workers' rights. So, and then I guess the other thing to note is that even for those that really are freelancers, really are independent contractors, it doesn't mean you're without rights altogether. For example, New York City has the recent Freelance Isn't Free Act that provides rights for freelancers, including the right to have a written contract that sets out the terms of their contractual arrangement, including how much they're going to get paid, and critically, the right to actually get paid. So I think that's probably a long-winded way of answering your question of who can join a union, but that kind of lays it out.
Terrific. That's a great place to start and a great segue to Natasha, who has been talking about the Freelance Isn't Free Act, and also has been talking about the visibility of work and workers in museums. Natasha? We can't hear you.
There we go. Sorry about that.
Okay.
So you want me to talk just specifically about worker visibility or about the freelance labor? Is that?
Why don't you start with worker visibility, and that relates to questions about equity and race and also freelancers. I think it covers it all.
Yeah, so, you know, one of the things that we as an organization are concerned with, and I think that I suspect that many people that are on this call are concerned with, is the issue of our visibility, not only within the institutions in which we work, but on a broader societal economic scale, right? So, and what does that mean? It's not just about having our voices heard within our workplace, but it's also about ensuring that the general public, our elected officials, those with power over the institutions that employ us, including boards, understand that it takes a village, in essence, to work within the cultural sector and to run cultural organizations. And that means that workers that are vital to cultural production and its presentation publicly include everything from security guards and maintenance workers to curators and fundraising staff and educators. And for us, we feel very strongly that in these conversations around whose voice gets heard over their labor, around their labor, is deeply impacted by race. It's deeply impacted by class. It's deeply impacted by gender and gender identity. And so we are looking at ways in which workers can come together and really have their voices heard. Does that cover it, Rachel?
That is an excellent start, and it raises the question of how that's influenced right now by what's happening during the pandemic. Because on the one hand, I think a lot we saw in the audience survey, it was heartrending how many museum educators have had decreased or wages and layoffs. On the other hand, museum doors are closed and they're going to be only half open, if that, for a long time to come. And to me, what that means is that the work of finding a role for the new museum in a new world is going to fall on educators, who are the ones who link most directly to the audience and to the community. So
it may not. I mean, as we know, over the last 20 or so years since the internet has developed into the beast that it is now, there tends to be an over-reliance on the idea that the internet solves all problems, right? So we don't need to rehire our workers if we can have a few people producing online content and then pretend that that has real human-to-human impact. I think the other thing that we're seeing in light of the economic downturn because of COVID, which it's not because of COVID, it's because of the capitalist system in which all of these institutions are structured. But one of the things that we're seeing is really actually the benefit of being in a union. And that when you have an organization made up of workers that can help amplify your voice and your needs and your rights as a worker, it puts you in a much better position to fight for what rehiring looks like when museums eventually do start bringing people back. And those workers that are left in the kind of 1099 freelance gig economy part of the industry really haven't had their voices amplified yet. Except for a handful of surveys that have been distributed and a little bit of data that started to emerge about the impact of income loss specifically for artists. But that kind of research hasn't yet really been done in terms of 1099 and freelance workers that aren't necessarily artists, that are arts administrators, that are museum workers, that might hold 3 or 4 positions to pay their bills. So this moment, I think, if anything, really amplifies the need for both solidarity with workers that are already lucky enough to be a part of a union, and also really thinking about the future of what organized labor looks like.
Which is so important. And Dan, I want to turn to you talking about organized labor. Some of the questions had to do with the very specific things like how to negotiate a contract and is it possible to have a union in a setting where there is collaborative work relations with the administrators and the staff involved. Would you like to start there?
Yes, I would. There's the union management relationship is adversarial by nature, but it doesn't mean it doesn't mean we're at all-out war. There's plenty of ways to come together to collaborate and find common goals to work around that is beneficial for the public, for the institution, for the worker, and management gets to manage whatever managers do too. You know, we often fight because we dig into positions, but often if you step back and just find this common area and concentrate on how best to address it, management and labor can work together beautifully. We're gonna fight, but we can. In terms of how to negotiate a contract, that's a long answer. But you know, you would roughly, you know, start with what you got and build is the easy way. And if it's a new union contract, you would put in try to bargain for certain things that are more unique to a union contract than a personal contract to perform work over a course of time, such as just cause for termination and a process for grievances if something goes wrong, seniority rights. We mostly go for real defined benefit pension plans and not 401ks and 403bs. You know, there's all sorts of things that go into that, but you know, how to negotiate a contract is you sit around the table and try to divide the pie or increase the pie or get the pie to fit everyone's idea of what this pie should be for all the parties involved. So I don't know, it's a great question, but it's a big one.
It would take a semester and we've only got a few minutes, but Maida, I know you have some things to say on that question of how to start off in a setting that's with cultural workers toward unionization, and also how to sort of connect to people who aren't going to end up in a union. Because I know you've done both.
Yeah, that question was for me. You know, so you know, there's been a lot of movement in the cultural institutions recently. I think for many of the reasons that people have laid out, you know, the fact that there are so many precarious workers in it, the fact that the pay is so low, and that you have, you know, often have people who are like really full of passion for what they're doing, really educated and talented, and yet are in very precarious positions, paid really low, and looking at themselves in contrast to the very wealthy corporate boards that often run these institutions. And so there's a huge, you know, a huge gap. And I think it's resulted in like a tremendous amount of interest in the cultural institutions, in workers, like trying to find some ways to bridge that gap and have a voice, you know, in the workplace. And people are very logically looking at unions because unions simply, you know, on the most basic level, change the power dynamic between you and the employer. They give you legal rights, and they also allow you through your collectivization to like leverage your collective power to push for more, which is what happens at the bargaining table, et cetera. And so, you know, my union is doing a lot of organizing. I know that Dan's is also, and obviously Natasha's talking to workers who are also interested in unionizing. And, you know, I think it's so exciting and so important that this is happening. I came out of organizing myself. You know, I was a clerical worker at Columbia University. We organized many years ago. The major issues were like pay equity, lack of recognition of women's work, et cetera. And while on the one hand, in some ways we've advanced because there's sort of a greater understanding that women actually do work, in other ways we've fallen as workers because we have really fallen on hard times because of all of the inequality. So I think it's so important and significant that workers in museums and cultural institutions are looking to fight back. And there is, you know, I was very like taken by what Natasha was saying about the you know, the fact that there are just so many different occupations, and you're calling it taking a village, because, you know, I think it's so inspiring that workers in all parts of an institution could actually get together and, you know, playing multiple roles, whether they're security guards, whether they're maintenance workers, whether they're curators or they're librarians, and understand their common humanity and be able to fight together for health benefits for everyone and for job security. And, you know, that's really major. You know, MoMA is my touchstone to go to because it's our biggest cultural institution, and they've been in our union for many, many years. And one of the things that was really, in 2000, we had a big strike there. And one of the things that was notable is that the museum had siloed people so much that people really didn't know each other. And at the end of the strike, people really did know each other. And today, you know, that really is true. There is an understanding that we can't have power in the museum unless we deal with the retail workers. And they're part of it, and the visitor services workers and the librarians. And it really does make a difference. And we have been able to like move the conditions so very much that it's been, that it's been an incredible experience. And so I really urge people out there, try to find a way to unionize, whether it's through like a legislative fix for freelancers or, organizing from the ground up. And if you have a union, be active in it, because, it can make such a huge difference in the workplace, and it really does it makes a difference in society too. So
I think we're mostly talking to people who are not yet in a union. And one of the questions that keeps coming up is, how do you talk to people who don't know anything about unions, and the idea hasn't crossed their mind except in a negative way? And somebody just wrote today, what do you do if management says, but we're family? Which is just one of the many, many things that will happen in response to the notion that maybe it's time to organize. I don't know. Natasha, you want to start on that one?
I mean, the thing that I will say first and foremost is that as someone that has been in leadership roles in organizations, who's been responsible for hiring and firing and defining people's work within an organization, and in many ways setting workplace culture, that is flat out a lie. As much of a nice and progressive lefty boss as I am, my interest as someone running a not-for-profit organization that is answerable to a board of directors, that is answerable to major donors, is never going to be fully aligned with that of the people that work below me. And on top of that, there's the pure power dynamics of it, which is a family, at least as far as I define it in my personal life, is a relationship of mutual respect. It's a relationship where no one person is any more a part of the family than another. And that is not the nature of employment. That is not the nature of a relationship that involves financial and legal contracts. That is not the nature of a relationship that occasionally requires NDAs. That is not the nature of a relationship where you are reliant on your employer to ensure that you have a roof over your head and food on your table. That's only part of a family institution if you're lucky enough to come from a family that pays for your rent and buys your groceries. So it's categorically not true that you are all a family in a workplace, and that can be extremely hard to navigate, I think, for many of us in the cultural sector, because we believe that our intellectual interests are aligned. We believe in the work that we're doing. We believe in the power of art. We believe in serving the public. And because we have these kinds of moral, seemingly moral alignments, it can be difficult to really separate our buy-in to a mission versus our need to protect ourselves and our fellow workers from what are many times employment structures that are not designed to protect anybody below the people at the very top.
Maida, do you want to add to that? About the tension between feeling like a family and
yeah, I mean, when people start organizing, first of all, I mean, people organize because there are issues that are in their workplace, and they often feel divided loyalties, and sometimes they have a great supervisor or a manager that they care about. Plus, they often care about the mission of the institution, the greater mission of the institution, and they don't want to ruin it. You know, they don't want to shut it down. They don't want to have it, you know, have it go bad. And you know, you have to work through all of these issues. Most unions, you know, you organize by having honest conversations with people, you know, about it, and about what the situation is. And, you know, today it is the case that most workers who are organizing have never been in a union before because there's a very low rate of unionization. And a lot of times their parents weren't in unions either, so they don't know anything about it. And that's both a difficulty, but it can also be a great thing because it's like a new idea that's very exciting to people that you could actually get together and collectively make a change. And there are a lot of things that appeal to people about being together, about bringing people together in community and solidarity to fight for things that they think are just and for things that are fair, like everybody having health care, like people having some rights on the job. I mean, those are appealing ideas to people, and they counter, you know, and they often counter the other things. And, you know, it's like an interesting thing because often, you know, we don't organize around the idea that, you know, that necessarily that management is a horrible enemy, because sometimes that doesn't work. You know, people don't see it that way. But through the process of organizing, you know, I think people do learn something about the dynamic of power relationships. And, you know, when Dan was talking about how there's like an adversarial relationship built into management, even though it's not necessarily hostile, I think through the process of organizing, people sort of understand actually the power of that adversarial relationship and working through things through an actual dialogue of equals. So.
Dan, did you want to speak to that?
Sure. I think families are healthier if people have equal voices, and I think the union provides that equality. We spoke earlier about that. And to the question of how do you approach people about unions, it's people who are good workers who like their job often think they don't need the union, but there's in a lifetime of work, there are so many instances where you don't want to be the only person in a room, and it could be anything from your job performance that you swear will never falls for some personal reason and you need someone to back you up. It could be that we're all going in the room together to get that extra raise or different work assignment. But there's, over the course of a working life, there are going to be times, and not just an instance, time after time. And people just need to be made to realize that, sure, you're doing okay now, but this is an organization that you are part of that helps decide how to go forward and to smooth out any bumps in the road. And I think people start to see it. It's easiest when someone gets in trouble. Then they're the first person to sign a union card. But I think when people are just made to think about their life of work and what that means, and how do you want to be alone in the room arguing over every single thing you want or need or deserve, or do you want to be part of a bigger group that will provide fairness and equity? And I think that's an easier starting point to get people to consider unions.
And speaking of fairness and equity, we also had a number of questions about racial equity in connection with unionization, and something that people didn't even raise in the initial questions, but that's really at the heart of all of this, is a question about gender equity. And the fact that one of the reasons that some of these jobs are paid as poorly as they are has to do with the fact that women have done a lot of them. So what about equity and unionization, which is another piece, I guess, of exactly what Dan's talking about, which is that people need to stand together. But can you speak about, Natasha?
So I think there were also a few questions that came in advance asking about the history of labor organizing, and I feel like that's maybe a good place to get into this. So I think there might be many people in this program that have at least heard of the Artist Union that was established in 1934, during the Works Progress Administration Federal Arts Project. And for those of you who don't know, just like really quickly, they came together to basically advocate for more jobs for artists within the Works Progress Administration. And also they fought censorship by calling on New York City's government to establish a municipal art gallery that was a response to the destruction of Diego Rivera's mural. So there's very much so actually a tie-in to international relationship between cultural producers and also, quite frankly, censorship of progressive communist cultural content. And so I think that this history is fairly well known, but one of the things that tends to get kind of passed over when we're talking about that era and the kind of foundation of early 20th century worker organizing in the sector is looking at the relationship of artists that were part of the Harlem Renaissance to the Artists Union. I'm sorry, I'm just like looking at my notes because I want to make sure that I get the date right on this. So basically in 1934, when the Artists Union started, there were very few African-American artists that were allowed to be part of the WA programs. And in response, a group of artists that were part of the Harlem Renaissance founded the Harlem Artists Guild, which was essentially a kind of offshoot / sister program to ensure advocacy for artists of color who had largely been left out of the leadership of the Artists Union, but also to put pressure directly on the WPA. So one of the things that they got was an increase in hiring really almost immediately after they formed. But in 1935, they were still not hiring African-American artists into leadership positions or management positions within the FAP. So they put even more pressure both on New York City government, on the federal government, and then also really pressure on their white peers in the Artists Guild. And as a result, in 1936, Charles Alston was promoted to be the first supervising artist on the WPA payroll, the first African-American to get that title, and was put in charge of a group of young artists that were painting murals for Harlem Hospital. So I think it's really important to sort of look back and say that in the moment that we're in, where there's such a large public call to improve the representation of people of color, both in the workforce and in the content of cultural institutions, that we're not reinventing the wheel, that this is an ongoing struggle that workers have been fighting for a very long time. And I think that there's things that we can learn from that history. I think there's also things that are really important to be reminded of, which is the relationship between organized labor, whether in a traditional union format or otherwise, and the ability of people of color and people regardless of gender to really get the representation and the rights that are rightfully theirs in the workplace. So it's important to just think about these intersections between race, class, and worker struggles.
And it's important to acknowledge that the history of unionization has not always reflected a commitment to equity, as Natasha has been just giving us a really great example of a positive example. But
Well, I mean, it wasn't, I mean, the thing is artists from the Harlem Artists Guild actually had to form their own group because they weren't being represented by a largely white artists union. So was there work together? Absolutely. But I think what it shows us is that one, there's an enormous power in workers coming together. And two, if we're not seeing the change that we want to see, collective action can get us there.
Absolutely. And certainly at this moment when so many people are coming together with a commitment to and a concern for equity, that's going to be high on the list of things that are being discussed in terms of organizing a union. We have, I know everybody has a lot more to say, but I just want to turn to some of the Q&A questions and to tell the audience who hasn't already put, anybody, if you haven't already put a question in, if you have a question, put it in the Q&A, and I can already tell you we're not going to get to all of them, but that we are going to provide our contact information at the end of the session, and we'll be following up. So forgive us if we don't get to your question. And I just want to start with one that talked, I think it probably was written when Allison was speaking, saying if we have protections under the law, what about at-will employment, and can't management just fire us? And or if we try to unionize, they'll make an example. And Allison, would you speak to that?
Right. So unionization is the best tool against at-will employment. If you are in a union and you have a union contract, then you are no longer an at-will employee. You are an employee that's governed by the terms of your collective bargaining agreement. And a very standard clause in all collective bargaining agreements is no discipline or termination without just cause. And that means, you know, whereas under at-will employment, management can fire you for any reason, good reason, bad reason, no reason at all. Under a union contract, you can only be fired or disciplined if management has just cause for doing so, meaning, and they have to justify the reasons. And as Dan alluded to earlier, union contracts also have a grievance and arbitration procedure where there's a process for challenging management actions as being without just cause. And there are steps to that. And the last step is that you get an opportunity to go in front of a neutral who will look at the facts and make a determination about whether or not something, you know, management actions were warranted, which is drastically different from at-will employment. So all of the dangers of at-will employment, all of the arbitrariness that's out there from at-will employment is really taken away when you join a union, when you form a union and you negotiate a union contract that has these basic foundational protections. And in terms of, you know, management making an example of somebody, I mean, I'll go back to federal labor law, which says that it is a violation of the law for your employer to retaliate against you in any way for engaging in activities in support of the union. And, you know, any union worth their salt as part of an organizing drive, if something like that happens, is going to challenge it and is going to, if an employer tries to make an example of you, the union's going to make an example of that employer by going to the National Labor Relations Board and filing unfair labor practice charges. The other thing that I always tell workers when I have a chance, if they're engaging in organizing activity and getting ready to form a union, and it's really sort of counterintuitive, which is that the more public you are about your support for a union, the less danger you're in of being retaliated against. And if everybody is collectively, publicly supportive of the union, then there's even less danger because management can't go after everybody. Now, that's not to say that there aren't bad bosses that don't do things that are against the law. It happens. But there are ways of fighting that, and collective action is the best way.
Maida?
I just wanted to say a couple of things. One thing is that it's that term at will. People always know about that term at will because it's in these personnel policy handbooks that are handed out to people. And it's really psychological warfare against employees because at-will employment is not something that's talked about a lot, but people know about it because employers create these handbooks and they say to people, and you're an at-will employee. And it's psychological warfare. And it sort of goes against that whole issue that we're a family. Because we're a family, but they're telling you, we have the rights, not you. We are in charge, not you. And that's the message that's sent when they create those at-will, handbooks. It's purposeful, and it's the advice that they get from their attorneys.
So speaking of, yeah, that's a really good point. And I think there are a lot of specifics that work in a similar way. And something that might is, here's a question: how is manager defined in union rules? My title is a manager, but I don't supervise people directly. Is that going to change whether or not I'm qualified to be in a union? And we talked more about misclassification, and I think this is a big...
Manager and supervisor are legal terms, and it has nothing to do with your title. It's all about what it is you actually do. And, especially in some of these cultural institutions, they are notorious for giving everybody these really highfalutin titles, manager of this, associate director of that, vice president of this. And, it also plays into this whole family thing where it's like trying to get people to feel aligned with management, even though they're really not. They really don't have any actual authority to hire or fire or discipline. They don't really have any actual authority to set or implement managerial policies. Those are the kinds of things that would exclude someone from the right to join a union or exclude someone from protections of the National Labor Relations Act. But it's really reserved for people that act in the interest of management. It is not people who are professional. It is not people who are highly educated. It is not people who have, significant expertise or experience and use that expertise and experience to help people in the organization with less expertise or experience. That does not make you a supervisor or a manager. That would exclude you from the right to join a union or exclude you from the right to engage in collective action. And so, you have to look beyond what your title is and what management is calling you. They could call you the Queen of England, and it doesn't matter. What matters is what you do and what you don't do.
Thank you. I think that's right on point. Another question, and there have been a few about this, how does the union fix wage discrepancies and inequality? And a related one was, how can we scrutinize pay rates? A lot of times one of the elements of being a family is there are a lot of secrets and people don't tell each other what they're making, and that plays into a lot of problems. Maida?
Yeah, well, that's one of the major powers of unionization, is that you get a lot more transparency from your employer. They have to share information with you, data, including how much everybody makes and what benefits they give, and they have to be more transparent about it. And you can analyze that data, and it can become extremely powerful, a powerful argument to deal with inequity. When the campaign that I came out of, we organized at Columbia, one of the first things we did was we looked at the data, and in fact, we found that workers of color averaged higher seniority but earned less, even at the same levels as white workers, and the same was true for women workers. So that although everybody was earning a low salary, you were particularly disadvantaged if you were a woman or you were a worker of color. And we were able to use that so powerfully in our contract negotiations when we went to argue for a contract, that it became the subject, of, all the campus talked about it. We had the alliance, all the students and faculty were on our side, and we were able to address it through our negotiations by negotiating an equity subsidy that actually compensated people for that that particular lack. Now that was based on what we did in our negotiations. I mean, you can address wage inequities in a number of ways, but you got to get to the bargaining table to do that, and you've got to find, you've got to organize a union. And then, negotiations, and Dan's going to be able to tell you about this too. Negotiations it is the most creative, nuanced process in the world. You can address almost any term and condition of employment in negotiations, and there are a zillion creative ways to do it and to fix problems. It's sometimes hard to convince management, and you sometimes have to fight for it, but it's a process that really works.
Yeah, thank you. And we'll let you speak to that, Dan, and also another question, which is, can there be multiple unions at the same institution, and can there be cross-institutional unions? So,
yes to both. To go back, Maida is right. One, even if it's brutal, negotiations is a blast to have a seat at the table at. It really is. You're really sitting there with all your coworkers' concerns on your mind. You need the institution to survive. Of course, we want more money, less work. They want more work, less money. We got to find something out. And yes, you could address any number of things at that table, and including disparity in wages, which, yes, in a unionized setting, we have access to all this data. We can assess that John makes 10 widgets an hour, Wendy makes 15 widgets an hour. Why is there a difference in pay? But we could also, which I know there's a fear with a lot of professional work, we also allow for flexibility if the jobs are very different from one to another. It's not just it's not necessarily you get locked into some rate and you're this high-performing specialized entity and everyone else is some schlub. There are ways to organize people with vast skill sets and different abilities, yet also protect basic core fairness and equality in wages. And without there's a reason why NFL players are unionized. They have the wild pay scales, but they know the value of coming together for certain core issues, and they also know how to recognize great independent skill. It's possible. In terms of cross unions, I have Local 374 and DC 37 represents the New York Public Library maintainers and janitors, also all the gardeners, museum educators, maintenance and security and clerical workers in all the Bronx, Brooklyn, Queens. So it is possible to have cross-employer and cross-title entities. And it's also possible to have several unions under one roof that perform specific functions. You might have iron workers do something, but you have a security guard union here and a clerical unit there that are independently operating. The Met is a mixed unit, and we found there was strength in collecting all the titles under one banner. It just gives you more force. There's also some value in having 3 or 4 unions simultaneously coming at management with some issue independently. There's a lot of different ways that there's to have advantages and disadvantages of multi-unions under one roof.
Another question about many different kinds of people under one roof is, how can organizers in a union and union workers build solidarity and support for contractual employees who depend on cultural institutions for their living? And I think that's a key, part of the question, organizing in a place where it's not likely that everybody working there is going to end up in the union. Maida?
Right. Well, one thing is that, employers try a zillion ways to erode unions also, and we ought to recognize that. And so often we have a core membership that we win at one time, and then management finds like a zillion different ways to say, well, actually, this worker shouldn't be in because they're a manager, or this worker is an independent contractor, et cetera. So one thing as unions is that we have a never-ending fight to try to to try to fix that erosion. Sometimes we can do it through legal means, like we actually can, under our contract, say, oh, you've got to rectify the situation and fix it. Sometimes it's gone on for too long, and so we have to figure out ways to organize that new group of workers. You know, I think really we had this at MoMA, where MoMA created, offloaded education work that really should have been part of our union, and instead created independent contractor jobs, highly questionable to handle that work. And ultimately, you know, if we can't win under our contract on those things, it's important that we try as unions to organize however we can. You know, I think Allison was explaining about whether, first of all, how many cases of misclassification there are where workers are called independent contractors and they shouldn't be, and that should be challenged. But even where workers really are independent contractors, we've got to find ways to organize. Natasha's been talking about that a lot. Maybe it'll take a legislative fix, but, you know, there needs to be, you know, we need to tackle this issue of how many workers are precarious these days in cultural institutions alone, in some form or another. And we need to figure out ways to push back on that. I think traditional unions is one way, a very important way, and I think workers should, where they can organize a traditional union, an employer-based union, they should do it. Or join a traditional, you know, employer-based union, they should do it. You know, if you're really like have been siloed into this independent contractor thing, we're gonna have to find more creative ways to have. And there's all kinds of worker formations that are happening now to try to address that. Not easy, but there has been some. You know, the pandemic actually brought about some progress in this area, because the pandemic assistance actually applies to gig workers, which is pretty amazing. So that's a stride forward, and we should try to maximize it.
Absolutely, and that's related to another question, which is how do you build momentum for a union in a workplace with huge turnover rates? And so it's, you know, it's partly this misclassification, everybody's a manager. The other thing is it's partly people who come in for a short gig and then they're gone again. How do we capture them?
It can be very challenging to do that, because the turnover can be hard. And I think, you know, I don't think there's one answer to it. I mean, we organized at the Tenement Museum, which, you know, does have it, you know, it's part-time educators. And so by the nature of the job, there was a very high turnover. It's all part-time educators. And you know, a lot of people are actors or have other jobs, and so they're not staking out this job for like a long-term gig. But there were a lot of issues, and in some ways, people's part-time and short-term status actually emboldened them around organizing in a way that very long-term workers sometimes are really scared of changing, you know, like trying to unionize because they have a lot at stake. You know, you've been in a place 20 years and you have like a retirement, et cetera. Whereas like younger short-term workers have been very bold. That's been my experience anyway, about trying to change their workplace. So
we're running out of time. I've got two questions I want to throw out at the end, and then a quick wrap up. And the two questions are interesting. If you've already started a conversation in your workplace, have held meetings, and you have a critical mass, what are the next steps? And then the other question is, what are the very first steps toward organizing? From the starting point of knowing anecdotally that there might be concern and interest in unionization, how do we start to connect? So I love that tandem of questions from our audience, and I want everybody to say a word or two about that.
I don't know whether you want me to say anything about it, but you know, because I know I've been talking, but you know, I think the first steps, usually you want to, this often starts with a small group, and sometimes a small group in one department starts talking to each other about these issues. And I always tell people the first thing you should do is create a spreadsheet and get everybody's name into it, so you at least know what your universe is, even if you don't know how to approach the rest of the universe. Try to start figuring out what the universe is. And then I think people should fairly early on reach out to an experienced union organizer, and AFSCME is a great union, and my union's a great union. So we both are, and there are others too. Just because I think, often those early stage plans are really important. Otherwise you end up like the Google person fired because they had a big confrontation with management instead of organizing their coworkers. So, I'd say, you could do that early on and start figuring out a plan for how you get to everybody else. And if you have critical mass, well, you are really ahead of the game, because then, you really can move forward. And if you do contact a larger union, it can be moved like very quickly, and you've already done a lot of internal work to do that. And it also laid the ground for being like a strong union in the future.
Absolutely. Natasha, did you want to say a few more words, and Dan too, about that? What to do at the very start?
Dan, do you want to go, or?
Sure, yeah. Oh, thanks. It's really, the whole business is just conversations. It's just, you have an idea, you and your coworker think that something needs to be done, find another person. It's probably already the people you're eating lunch with. It's probably the people you're already hanging out after work with. And then it's just slowly build with a focus on what do we have, what would we like, and how do we think we can get it. Maida is right. Reach out to somebody. The union is not some outside entity that just drops into your workplace. It is you, but you need the framework and the support of people who have been doing this. Just the nuts and bolts of it. Also to bounce ideas outside of the bubble, which is your workplace. Also, we provide some cover if things go wrong, which was mentioned earlier. If the boss starts giving a hassle about organizing, that's where we would step in further. But it's just a series of conversations that just moves upwards and outwards until you're ready to make the move.
I think that's a great description. It is indeed all about conversations. I hate to say it, but we need to move toward the end. And so I have a final question for the panelists, just to wrap up on a quick note. If you could each describe your experiences with unionization in one phrase, what would the phrase be? Allison?
I mean, I think that the word that immediately comes to my mind is collective power. That being in a union is all about joining together with your coworkers to increase your power and your voice in the workplace. And to me, that's what it's all about.
Thanks. Maida?
I have to go with Allison too. It's about, it's about empowering yourself as a group and changing the dynamics, through empowering.
Natasha?
I'd have to say it is justice, that when we come together, we no longer have to accept what is given or trickled down to us, but can actually get what we are entitled to as human beings and as workers.
Thank you. Dan?
I found it's funny that being part of a union has become this all-enveloping blanket around me, but it's not suffocating, but it started out as just workplace protection, and then it morphed into friends, family, neighborhood stuff, any sort of issue that you're after, there's some fragment of the union that will help you, environmental issues, racial justice, and all of a sudden there's no differentiation between the union and any of these other parts of your life. It's really a wonderful thing when you really get completely immersed in it.
Thank you. Well, that brings us round to what I started with in a way, which is what Dan's describing is what I talk about as the culture of solidarity. And it partly means gathering together for your collective empowerment and finding justice. And it partly means that there are lots of parts of life that are part of that culture of solidarity. So that unions provide art classes, and they sponsor baseball games, and they help people learn English, and they help them register to vote. And all of those things are of a piece of that process of unionization and a culture of solidarity. So I want to just thank the panelists so much for doing this, and let the audience know that we are willing and happy to follow up and continue the conversation. We're going to end with a slide with our contact information. And I know we all want to really thank NYCMER, and particularly Michelle Cooper, who is the first person I came into contact with in organizing this session. And she had medical problems and I don't think can be here tonight, but they did an incredible job. So thank you all the panelists, and thank you to NYCMER. And I just want to say one other thing. Natasha mentioned something when we were talking about a culture of solidarity. We talked about how we don't have class solidarity in this country so much as we have values solidarity. So I would like to leave everybody with that, and a panel of resources. And thank you again.